Officer Mira Drayton snatched the federal flight authorization out of Reese Calder's hand, looked at the quiet black man in the plain dark coat, and laughed. She called it a cheap forgery bought online, tore it in half across the hood of her patrol cruiser, and ordered him restrained for trying to enter a military zone. Reese did not resist. He only checked his watch and lifted the encrypted radio clipped to his belt. At that moment, the runway alert horn began to sound, and a cold voice came through the speaker. Air Mobility Command calling Eagle Actual. Confirm landing authority. If you want to watch arrogance pay its full price, subscribe to this channel right now and stay for the breathless reversal of power waiting just ahead. The fog came off the eastern fields in slow sheets that morning, dragging across the perimeter fence of Black Ridge Regional Airport. Reese Calder drove in from the county road earlier that morning, roughly an hour before a military transport was scheduled to break through that same fog and set its wheels on the shared runway. He drove a 9-year-old sedan with a cracked side mirror because that was what he always drove on mornings. He intended to see the truth of a place instead of the performance a place put on for inspectors. There was no rank on his coat, no ribbon, no polished insignia, only a leather case of documents and a black encrypted radio riding against his hip. He parked outside Gate 4 and walked to the security booth with the unhurried step of someone who had spent years learning that panic never made a runway safer. Behind the glass, a young officer named Callum Hale set down a paper cup of coffee and straightened up. Reese passed a federal flight operations authorization and a government identification card through the tray slot and asked politely for access to the approach lighting array serving runway 27. Callum ran the document through the scanner, and the small screen above his console turned a clean, unambiguous green. Federal Air Operations, it read. Authorized access. Callum's hand had already moved toward the gate release when Lieutenant Mira Drayton stepped into the booth, bringing with her the smell of expensive coffee and colder air. Her eyes went first to the sedan in the lot, then to Reese's shoes, then to his face, and something in her expression settled into a conclusion before a single word was spoken. She asked which company he was delivering for and whether he understood that vendor traffic used the service road on the far side of the terminal. Reese answered without heat, because heat was a currency he had learned not to spend early. He explained that he was there under a federal operations order to verify the approach lighting on runway 27 ahead of a military arrival, that his authorization had already been scanned, and that the confirmation was displayed on a screen roughly 18 inches from her shoulder. She told him that anyone could print a document, that the airport had recently dealt with a man carrying a badge he made at a copy shop, and that the shared use area was not a place where people wandered in with an old car and a story. Callum cleared his throat and said quietly that the system had returned a valid access confirmation. Mira told him to close the screen. The young officer hesitated, and in that hesitation, Reese saw everything he needed to know about the culture of the place. Callum closed the screen. Mira reached into the tray, lifted the federal authorization between 2 fingers, and held it up in the gray light, the way a person holds something found at the bottom of a drain. 2 baggage handlers stopped near the fence line to watch, and a woman waiting for a shuttle turned to see. Mira let the silence stretch until she was certain she had an audience. Then she asked, in a voice pitched to carry, whether he truly believed that outfit was going to walk him into a military zone. He did not answer. He asked for her name, her rank, and her badge number in the flat, unbothered tone of a man filling in a form, and that tone did something to Mira Drayton that shouting never could have done. So she raised the volume instead, her interrogation right there in the open apron, deliberately loud, asking where he had bought the document and whether he understood that impersonating a federal officer carried a prison sentence. She turned the paper over and called it a cheap print, remarked on the seal, said the ink was wrong, though she had never in her life examined the ink on a genuine one. Then she noticed the radio on his hip and laughed out loud, asking whether the little black box made him feel important. Reese waited until she finished, then told her that the verification line was printed along the lower edge of the document, that it was answered around the clock, and that a single call would settle the matter in under 90 seconds. Callum tried once more, saying he had seen the green confirmation himself, that it had come back before the lieutenant arrived. Mira turned on him and asked whether he would enjoy an insubordination entry attached to his file during his probationary review, and how many departments hired officers who left with a mark like that. Callum looked at the floor because he was young. He had a car payment and a mother with a bad hip, and the woman in front of him had a last name that appeared on a bronze plaque in the terminal lobby. Mira walked to her patrol cruiser, laid the authorization flat on the hood, smoothed it once with her palm as if preparing to sign something, and tore it cleanly in half. The sound was small and very distinct in the fog. She held one half out toward him and told him to keep it as a souvenir of the day he tried to walk into a place that was never going to belong to him. A luggage cart stopped rolling. Somebody near the terminal doors made a low sound of disbelief. Reese took the torn half without a word, folded it once, and slid it into his coat pocket, and he did it so carefully that the care itself became an accusation. He asked whether she was the ranking officer at that gate, and whether she wished to state on the record that she had denied access after a valid system confirmation. He told them both that obstruction of a federal flight operations task was logged automatically in the Joint Operations Record, that the log required nobody's cooperation, and that it had already begun. Mira laughed and said the Drayton family had been at Blackridge before he knew the airport existed, that her family had paid for a third of the new terminal wing, and that people like him always left through the same gate they arrived at. She was still speaking when the encrypted radio emitted 3 short tones, spaced in a pattern nobody standing in that fog had ever heard before. The tones were not loud. They were simply wrong for the setting, a sound belonging to another category of world entirely, and every person within 30 feet went still. Reese did not reach for the device. He looked at Mira with an expression almost like patience, the way a man looks at a driver who has just run a light he cannot yet see the consequences of. Then the speaker opened and a voice came through it, clipped and unhurried and absolutely certain of itself. Air Mobility Command calling Eagle Actual, it said. Time to target approach. Confirm field status. Mira moved faster than she thought. She stepped forward, pulled the radio off his belt before he could raise a hand, and keyed it the way she had seen done in films, announcing that the owner of the device was in custody for fraudulent federal credentials and that airport police had the situation under control. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice asked for her identification code. She did not have one, and when she offered her name and badge number instead, the voice repeated the request with the particular flatness of a system that had just categorized her as an unauthorized transmission on a restricted channel. It told her she was speaking on a secured military frequency, that the transmission was being recorded at 3 separate facilities, and that she was to hand the device immediately to Colonel Reese Calder, call sign Eagle Actual. Callum Hale's head came up slowly, and the word colonel went through the small crowd like water finding a crack. Mira tried to hold her face, and then asked why a colonel would drive a car like that, why a colonel would dress like a man who fixed air conditioners, why a colonel would not simply say so. He held out his hand, and she gave the radio back because there was no version of the next 30 seconds in which she did not. He keyed the device, spoke a short verification sequence composed of letters and words that meant nothing to anyone else present, and waited for the acknowledgement tone. Then he made his report in the same tone he had used to ask for her badge number, stating that the federal inspection team's access to runway 27 had been physically obstructed at Gate 4, that the flight operations authorization had been examined, confirmed by the airport's own scanner, and then destroyed by an officer of the airport police in view of witnesses. On the other end, Major General Gideon Croft came onto the channel and asked the only question that mattered, which was whether Colonel Calder could certify Black Ridge Regional as fit to receive the inbound transport. Reese turned and looked through the chain link at the long gray line of runway 27, where the approach lighting array should have been running its verification cycle since first light, and instead sat dark and patient in the mist, exactly as dark as when he arrived. He looked at the maintenance vehicle that should have been out there and was not. He looked at the empty service road where a technician crew should have finished earlier. Then he lifted the radio and said the words that changed the shape of the morning for every person standing at that gate. "Black Ridge is red hold," he said. "The field is not certified to receive the mission." The response did not come from the radio. It came from the tower, from the field horns, from the amber strobes that woke along the perimeter road and began turning in the fog. Ground vehicles halted where they stood. Inside the tower, a controller was already reading a mandatory hold advisory into a recorded line, and Mira Drayton turned in a slow circle and watched an airport she had believed was hers come to a stop because of a conversation she had chosen to have. She looked down at the torn half still lying on the hood of her cruiser, and for the first time that morning, something in her face genuinely moved. Reese walked past her, retrieved the second piece, and held both halves together, aligning the torn edge with the neatness of a man reassembling something for a photograph. He did not gloat, because gloating was the amateur's version of what he was doing. He simply looked at her, at the badge, at the young officer standing behind her with his hands at his sides. Then he said the thing that Mira Drayton would hear again in her own head every night for a very long time. "You did not tear up my authority," he told her. "You tore up the proof that you had been warned." Harlan Quill arrived minutes later in a golf cart driven too fast with two members of airport administration hanging on behind him. He had received the hold advisory while discussing catering arrangements in a hangar, and he had understood at once what a diverted military transport would mean for the shared use contract that funded roughly a third of his operating budget. He listened to Mira's version, which was already different from the events of moments earlier, nodding in the practiced way of a man who is not listening but deciding. Then he turned to Reese with a warm, open expression and suggested that an honest misunderstanding at a gate should not be allowed to snowball into a federal incident. He mentioned lightly that Black Ridge held a joint use agreement worth several $100 million over its full term, that the agreement had survived 3 administrations, and that no single inspector had ever managed to freeze it. Reese handed him a secured tablet. On the screen was the electronic operations order, time-stamped and digitally signed, bearing the authentication block of Air Mobility Command and the specific language granting its bearer authority to place a shared use field into hold status on his own certification. Quill read it twice and then reached for delay, saying the airport's counsel would need to verify the document independently. That verification might take some hours, and that perhaps the hold could be provisionally suspended as a gesture of cooperation. Reese asked Quill a single question, which was whether the gate credential scanner maintained an access log. Quill answered a shade too quickly, that gate data was held in a temporary buffer for operational purposes only, that it cycled itself automatically, that nothing was retained long enough to be useful. Mira's shoulders came down half an inch, because for 20 minutes she had been carrying a small hard knot of worry about a green screen that Callum had closed, and Quill had just told her it no longer existed. Then Reese explained, without any change in tone, that authorizations issued for special mission tasking do not verify locally. When Callum ran that document through the scanner, the query traveled to a federal server, was authenticated there, and was recorded at the moment of the query, along with the terminal identifier, the badge number of the officer operating it, and the timestamp. The airport's buffer was irrelevant. The federal record showed that the authorization had been scanned, confirmed valid, and displayed as green earlier that morning, and the tearing had occurred minutes later. Quill's face did the arithmetic before his mouth caught up. Those minutes were not a mistake, not a case of poor lighting, or a bad photograph, or an officer who could not read a seal. Those minutes were a decision. He glanced at Mira for the first time the way a man looks at a package he has been asked to carry across a border. Reese gave them the choice then in the same flat voice, and it was not really a choice at all. Preserve every camera feed, every gate log, every radio recording, and every maintenance record touching runway 27, he said, or convert this from an obstruction matter into the destruction of federal evidence, which is a different chapter with different sentences in it. Quill said immediately that of course everything would be preserved in the voice of a man volunteering to hold a door open while the building burns behind him. Behind them, beyond the shuttle lane, a line of 4 black vehicles with federal plates came off the county road and turned toward the administration entrance without slowing at the guard shack. Nobody had called them in the last 40 minutes. They had been on the road since earlier. Inspector Tessa Marlowe came out of the second vehicle before it had fully stopped. Early 50s, gray suit, no jewelry. Moving with the economy of someone who had done this in 11 states and did not intend to be surprised in a 12th. Her team spread along Gate 4, 1 to the booth, 2 toward the maintenance road, 1 setting a tripod camera on the apron. She shook Reese's hand and asked what she had walked into, and he told her in 90 seconds, leaving nothing out and adding nothing. Then she asked to see the document, and he produced both halves from his coat pocket. Marlowe aligned them, examined the seal, and slid them into a clear evidence sleeve while standing 4 feet from Mira Drayton. Mira watched a piece of paper she had considered garbage 30 minutes earlier become an exhibit and said to no one specifically that this was an enormous overreaction to a credentialing dispute. Reese turned to her then and gave her the information she had not yet understood, which was that the obstruction was not the reason he had come. Black Ridge Regional had filed 3 consecutive quarterly certifications stating that the approach lighting array on runway 27 was fully operational, tested, and compliant. Federal correlation data told a different story. The array's signal signature had been intermittent for weeks, absent entirely for stretches of several nights, and yet every certification had come back clean and signed. Soren Finch, the lead technician for airfield lighting, came around the corner of the maintenance building, at that moment wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped when he saw the federal vehicles. Tessa Marlowe asked how long the array on runway 27 had been degraded. He said it had been failing since the spring, that he had submitted multiple requests for overnight runway access to isolate the fault, and that most had been denied outright by the airport police division, while others had been approved and canceled the same evening under the same logged reason: restricted period, security event. He said he had eventually sent a report of his own to a federal safety line and had assumed for months that nobody had opened it. Mira said sharply that she had never blocked a maintenance request in her life, that any access restrictions she signed had come down from Quill's office as security directives, and she said it with genuine indignation, which was interesting because it was the first true thing she had said in an hour. Quill answered instantly that the police division held operational discretion over field access, that his office issued general guidance and nothing more, and that he had never instructed anyone to obstruct a technician. 2 seconds of silence followed, and in it a 6-year alliance made a sound like ice. Reese asked Marlowe to pull every access record for the maintenance corridor, going back months, sorted by approving officer, and cross-referenced against the field's own event calendar, on multiple separate nights. The technical corridor had been closed to all maintenance activity under a designation entered as a private function or a donor event, and on every one of those nights, the airport's official record showed scheduled work on the runway 27 lighting array as performed and complete. Somebody had written a record of labor that never happened, and somebody else had signed it, and the signatures were not anonymous. Soren waited until Marlowe reached the end of the list, then asked Reese to walk with him. He led them past the maintenance building, past a row of dead grass in a chain-link enclosure, to a storage bay with a heavy padlock and a federal property tag on the door that had been fastened with a plastic tie rather than a seal. Minutes later, a bolt cutter solved the problem, and the roll door came up on 84 crates of brand-new approach lighting units, still banded, still sealed, still carrying shipping documentation from a delivery accepted earlier. Not one of them had been opened. The paperwork told the rest of it in the bloodless language that fraud always uses. Black Ridge had received the full replacement budget, drawn against the joint use agreement, and disbursed in 2 payments. And the completion certification filed months earlier stated that the array had been replaced end to end, tested under load, and returned to service. The contractor of record was Drayton Infrastructure, an electrical and construction firm operating out of a business park 11 miles north, run by a man named Reed Drayton. Reed Drayton was Mira's cousin. Harlan Quill had signed the acceptance of completed work, and Mira Drayton had signed the companion attestation certifying that the work zones were secured and access controlled throughout the project. Reese stood in the doorway of that bay, with the fog thinning behind him, and understood at last the true architecture of the morning. Mira had not stopped him at Gate 4 only because he was a black man in a plain coat driving an old car, although that was the door her decision walked through. She had stopped him because a federal inspector reaching the approach lighting array would find, within 20 minutes, 84 unopened crates and a system that had never been touched. If she had simply called the verification line and been slow and bureaucratic about it, she could have delayed him a full day. Instead, she had needed an audience, and her need to be seen humiliating a man she considered beneath her had converted a routine inspection into a federal incident with a recorded transmission, a preserved server log, and 4 vehicles of investigators standing in her airport before the morning was fully underway. Back in the administration building, Mira made her stand on a technicality, and it was not a bad one. She insisted that her signature covered gate security and perimeter control during the work window, nothing more. That she had certified access was restricted, which it demonstrably had been, and that she had no qualification whatsoever to evaluate whether electrical work had been performed correctly or at all. If crates were sitting in a bay, that was a contractor problem and an engineering problem, and neither of those things wore her badge. It was a reasonable argument, and it survived about 9 minutes. Tessa Marlowe put the camera archive on the wall display, and the timeline she had built from it did not care about reasonable arguments. On 4 separate nights during the alleged work period, a vehicle bearing Drayton Infrastructure markings had entered the restricted maintenance corridor after dark, and on each occasion it had bypassed the inspection point entirely. On each occasion, the officer who raised the barrier arm and waved it through, in uniform on camera, was Lieutenant Mira Drayton. On 2 of those nights, the vehicle left after 14 minutes, and nobody replaces an approach lighting array in 14 minutes. Quill, who had spent 40 minutes positioning himself as a shocked administrator, took a visible step away from her chair, and everyone in the room saw him do it. Mira said the vehicle had been on the approved contractor list. Marlowe agreed that it had, then asked why an approved vehicle needed to skip an inspection point that existed specifically to log what went in and out, and Mira did not answer. Callum Hale stood up. He was pale, and his voice was not steady, and he said what he had come to say anyway. That earlier that morning he had scanned the federal authorization, that the screen had returned a green confirmation, that he had seen it clearly and told the lieutenant twice. He said she had ordered him to close the screen, and that when he objected, she had threatened his probationary file. Mira turned on him and called him a traitor with the real venom that comes from a place where loyalty and obedience have been the same word so long that a person forgets they were ever separate. Reese answered before Callum could. "Telling the truth is not betrayal," he said. "Ordering a subordinate to lie for you and using his rent and his mother's health as the leverage, that is a betrayal of the badge, of him, and of every person who ever assumed a uniform meant something at a gate." Then the encrypted radio spoke into the silence, and Major General Croft advised that the inbound transport had entered a holding pattern at altitude, that it carried emergency communications infrastructure bound for a coastal county that had lost every tower in a storm days earlier, and that it held reserve fuel for roughly 30 minutes before a diversion became mandatory. Here was the trap. Reese Calder had learned to recognize in himself over years, and it had his own name carved into it. He had spent the morning being humiliated in front of an audience, and there was a version of the next 10 minutes in which he let Blackridge sit in red hold, let the transport divert, and let Mira Drayton and Harlan Quill wear the consequence in every record that followed. It would have been defensible. It would also have been revenge wearing the uniform of procedure, and he had watched better men than himself lose their integrity to exactly that costume. He stood in the thinning fog for the length of one long breath, made himself separate the woman from the mission, and then split the federal team in two. Tessa Marlowe kept 4 people on evidence preservation, sealing the bay, imaging the servers, and taking statements while memories were fresh. Reese took Soren Finch, 2 technicians, and a lighting specialist, and went looking for a way to land an airplane. Runway 27 was unusable and would stay unusable for weeks, but Blackridge had a second runway, 09, shorter by 900 feet, less frequently used, and served by an older independent lighting system that had never been part of the replacement contract because nobody had thought it worth stealing money over. Runway 09 was long enough for the transport at its current landing weight, given the surface and the wind out of the northeast with margin. Reese walked the first 2,000 feet himself because he did not certify things he had not looked at, and the surface was sound. Then they reached the taxiway connecting 09 to the cargo apron, and they stopped because it was full of cars, 19 of them, black and silver and pearl white, parked nose to tail in 2 neat ranks with a white event tent going up on the adjacent hardstand and a catering truck backed against the fence. A banner half unrolled along the tent frame read Drayton Family Foundation Annual Aviation Gala. Soren said quietly that the setup crew had been out there since early that morning, and Reese asked who had authorized use of an active taxiway as a parking area on a day with a scheduled military arrival. The answer was in this permit file within 90 seconds, carrying Mira Drayton's signature and Harlan Quill's counter-signature. The joint use agreement contained explicit language establishing absolute priority for military operations over private activity on shared surfaces and requiring notification whenever any portion of a movement area was occupied for a non-aviation purpose. No notification had been filed and the permit had been issued days earlier. On the same afternoon, the arrival schedule had been distributed to airport administration. Reese ordered the taxiway cleared. Quill objected, and for the first time that morning, he objected with real feeling because the first guests were arriving at the north entrance, and among them were 2 members of the airport board, a state senator, and the woman who chaired the foundation that had funded the terminal wing. Reese listened to all of it, and then said one sentence evenly. Every minute of delay from this moment forward is entered into the federal record under the name of the individual who caused it. Quill folded so fast it was almost graceful. He got on the radio himself and ordered ground crews to clear the taxiway, ordered the tent crew to stop, ordered the catering truck moved, all in the loud, confident voice of a man performing decisiveness for an audience that had already made up its mind about him. Within 20 minutes, drivers in valet vests were moving 19 luxury vehicles onto the overflow lot, while a state senator stood at the fence, watching his own car get relocated. Mira watched it from the administration steps, and what she was watching precisely was the transfer of gravity. These were people who had greeted her by name every morning for 6 years, who had held doors, who had laughed at things she said that were not funny. Now they moved when the man in the plain dark coat spoke, and they did not look at her at all. She was not being punished in that moment. She was being subtracted. Quill came out of the building, walked past her without a word, and took a cart out to supervise the clearing personally. And she understood then that her last ally had already begun writing his own version of the day. So she went back inside, went upstairs, and used her administrative credentials to open the gate access system. It was Callum Hale who noticed she was gone. He had been watching her the way a man watches weather he has been caught in before. And when he found the steps empty, he went and found Tessa Marlowe. Marlowe did not run. She walked to the second-floor operations room with 2 of her people and opened the door without knocking. And Mira Drayton was standing at the console with the access log administration panel open and a selection of records highlighted. She turned around with complete calm and said she was preserving a backup copy for the investigation, that she had assumed federal personnel would want a local export, that she had been trying to help. Then, one of Marlowe's technicians sat down at an adjacent terminal, pulled the system's own action history, and read it aloud without inflection. Credentials belonging to Lieutenant M. Drayton had authenticated to the Gate Access Administration module. Those credentials had initiated a purge command targeting all gate transaction records for the current date. The command had paused pending a confirmation prompt still sitting unanswered on the screen behind her. Nothing had been exported anywhere, and the word backup did not appear in the history at any point. Mira changed her story with the fluency of long practice, saying her credentials had been compromised, that Callum Hale had watched her enter her password dozens of times, that a young officer with a grudge and something to gain had used her account to make her look guilty. She was still saying it when Marlowe asked the technician whether the operations console required biometric confirmation for administrative actions. It did, and had since the system was installed. The action history carried a fingerprint verification stamp for every one of the 3 commands, and all 3 matched the print on file for Lieutenant Mira Drayton, captured that morning from the sensor she was still standing beside. The federal team pulled the file and played it in the operations room with the door open, and it was clear enough to catch the small sound of a coffee cup being set down. Callum's voice came first, saying the system had returned a valid access confirmation, that it was green, that the man had priority clearance. Then Mira's voice, unhurried and entirely without doubt. She said she did not care what the system said, that the man had walked up to her gate in a beat-up car, looking like he had come to fix something, and that people like that did not get to decide where they went on her field. She said, and the recording preserved every syllable, that she was going to teach him who controlled this gate. Quill, summoned back upstairs, listened to a summary and immediately began the work of separation. He spoke about the airport police division as though it were a vendor he had recently considered replacing, saying that Lieutenant Drayton had operated with unusual independence, that she had leveraged her family's standing in ways that made her difficult to supervise, that he had raised concerns internally and could produce the correspondence. Mira began to laugh then, and it was not a pleasant sound. She told the room that Harlan Quill had personally instructed her in his office months earlier to keep every inspector and safety official off runway 27 and out of the north maintenance corridor until after the gala. She said she had the calendar invitation, that she had photographed his whiteboard that day out of habit, and that she had kept both because she had grown up in a family that taught her never to be the only person holding a document. Quill told her to stop talking, and she told him what he could do with his advice. He said her family's contractor had submitted the invoices. She said he had signed the acceptance. In 4 minutes, the two of them laid out for a federal investigator the exact structure of an arrangement that would otherwise have taken months of subpoenas to assemble, and they did it because each believed the other was about to do it first. Quill's phone rang, and something in his posture failed when he saw the screen. It was the chair of the airport board calling to inform him that following notification from Air Mobility Command, the shared use agreement between Black Ridge Regional and the United States Air Force had been suspended effective immediately, pending federal review, and that the board would convene an emergency session regarding his continued authority as director. He set the phone face down on the table with exaggerated care, as though it had become fragile, and did not pick it up again. Mira made her own call from the corridor, and she made it to her father. She spoke to him for 3 minutes in a low, fast voice, and when she came back into the room, she carried her phone out in front of her like a warrant and told Reese that her father wished to speak with him. Reese looked at the phone and did not take it. He told her to put it on speaker and set it on the table, and she did, because she believed she was about to watch something familiar happen. Harrison Drayton's voice filled the room with the warmth of a man who has never once been told no by a stranger. Then, without any change in that warmth, he mentioned that he had known the senior senator for 30 years, that he sat on 2 boards with people who took a keen interest in defense appropriations, and that careers in federal service could be surprisingly delicate things, particularly for men who mistook a single morning for a crusade. Reese let him finish and then said, in the same voice he had used at the gate, that Mr. Drayton should be aware he was speaking into a federal operations area during an active investigation, that the conversation had been captured from the first word, and that a transcript would be attached to the case file. Harrison Drayton said that he had merely been expressing a father's concern, that of course he had every confidence in the process, and ended the call. Mira stood looking at her own phone on the table. Tessa Marlowe closed the moment out with the plainest language of the day, saying that this was no longer a matter of internal airport discipline, that the file covering the falsified safety certifications, the procurement, the contractor relationship, the obstruction, and the attempted destruction of records would be transferred to the Federal Inspector General and referred to the United States Attorney for evaluation, and that every individual in the room should retain counsel. She said it without drama. It landed harder for that. Harlan Quill was formally relieved of operational authority and escorted to a conference area to wait, and he went without a word, carrying his jacket over his arm. Mira's access credentials were deactivated minutes later on the same system she had tried to purge by a technician who had to ask someone how to spell her last name. She did not learn of it until she walked down to the police division to empty her locker and held her card against the panel, and the light went red. Callum Hale stood on the other side of the glass, close enough to reach the release button, and she said his name and told him to open the door. He looked back at her for a long moment, then shook his head once and turned away. She found Reese in this corridor 20 minutes later, and she was not the same woman who had stood at the gate at dawn. She told him he had destroyed her entire life over a piece of paper, that she had given 6 years to that airport, that she had never taken $1, that whatever her cousin's company had or had not done was nothing she had ever seen an invoice for, and that one bad morning at a gate should not be permitted to erase all of it. Reese walked to the window at the end of the corridor, waited until she followed, and pointed out at runway 27, gray and quiet, under a sky that was finally beginning to clear. He told her that between 400 and 600 people came down through that approach every week, in weather far worse than this, trusting a lighting array that 3 signed documents called new and functioning, and that 84 unopened crates said had never been touched. The torn authorization did not create any of this, he said. It was simply the moment the lie became visible to somebody who was required to write it down. Behind them, the radio came alive, and the tower advised that runway 09 had its full verification cycle, that every lighting segment had passed under load, that the surface inspection was clean, and the connecting taxiway clear, and that the wind was holding steady out of the northeast at 9 knots. Mira Drayton heard her own airport report itself as ready and understood that it was reporting to him. Reese did not lift the radio immediately, and the delay was deliberate. He went out to the operations balcony and pulled the current data himself, reading it line by line the way he had read such things for 2 decades. Wind velocity and crosswind component against the runway heading, within limits, with margin. Surface condition dry, braking action good. Every lighting segment verified under load by federal technicians rather than airport staff. Pavement classification, adequate against the transport's landing weight. Obstruction survey on the connecting taxiway clear. There was pressure on him, and he knew exactly what it was made of. There was a coastal county with no communications, a general waiting on a channel, an aircraft burning into reserve, and a desire, entirely human and entirely disqualifying, to be the man who fixed what these people had broken. So he checked the crosswind figure a second time and the pavement report a second time. And only when the numbers told him the same thing twice did he raise the radio. "Eagle Actual to Air Mobility Command," he said. "Black Ridge is released for arrival, runway 09. Hold status lifted for that surface only. Runway 27 closed indefinitely." Croft acknowledged and read the clearance back. Then he added in a voice that had shed some of its formality that a temporary federal management element would arrive within days to assume oversight of all military-related operations at the field, that the shared use agreement would remain suspended through the review, and that Colonel Calder's team was to remain on site until relieved. He said one more thing before clearing the channel, which was that he had listened to the recording of the transmission at Gate 4, and that he had listened to it twice. He did not say anything further about it, and he did not need to. Reese refused to treat the airport as a single guilty organism, drawing the line where it belonged, between the people who had built the falsehood and the people who had been maneuvered into standing near it. And he drew it in writing so nobody could smear it later. Soren Finch was placed in charge of the technical restoration effort under direct federal supervision, with authority to schedule night closures without approval from anyone whose name appeared on a plaque. And he received the news standing in a hallway holding a rag, not entirely able to process it. Callum Hale was not suspended. He was directed to remain in his position, provide a complete and truthful statement, and be available to investigators for as long as they required. Reese told the young man that his silence at the gate would appear in the record because it had happened, and that his account of the scan and the order to close the screen would appear there as well, and that both would be weighed by people whose job that was. He told him that there would be a next time in some other hallway with some other person holding leverage over his rent, and that he would need to have already decided what he was. Then Mira Drayton was asked to surrender her badge, her sidearm, her equipment, and her access card, and the request was made quietly by Tessa Marlowe in a small office with the door open. She set each item on the desk in a neat row, badge last, and straightened it slightly with one finger before she took her hand away. The whole thing took less than 90 seconds, and the silence in the corridor outside where a dozen employees had gathered, and not one of them said a word to her, was heavier than any confrontation could have been. At the door, she stopped and turned back to Reese with the question she had apparently been assembling for an hour. She asked whether it felt good, whether standing there while everyone in the building did what he said, while people who had smiled at her for 6 years watched her carry her own coat out, whether that was what power felt like. Reese considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Power is not making people afraid of you," he said. "Anyone can do that with a badge and a bad morning. Power is knowing you have the authority to crush a person completely, holding that in your hand, and choosing to do only what is correct instead." He did not say it as a lesson or as a rebuke, but the way a man states a specification. Mira Drayton looked at him a moment longer, then walked out into the parking lot without her badge for the first time in years, and behind her, faint and then steadily louder, the sound of 4 turboprop engines began to come down out of the clouds. The transport broke through the last of the overcast, gray and enormous and unhurried, and it came down the 09 approach with the new sun catching along its spine. The aircraft touched down cleanly, rolled out, and turned onto the connecting taxiway that had been full of luxury cars earlier, and the sound of it rattled the glass in the administration building. Somebody near the cargo apron started clapping and then stopped, uncertain whether it was appropriate, and the silence that followed was more respectful than the applause would have been. What the people watching understood, some of them for the first time, was that the man in the plain coat had not shut their airport down to make a point, and had not opened it again to be thanked. I had done both for the same reason, which was that a runway is a promise made to everyone who ever comes down toward it in the dark. Croft called once more after the offload had begun, saying the equipment would be moving toward the coast within 2 hours, and that he was aware how much simpler the morning would have been if a certain colonel had accepted a runway he had not personally verified. He thanked him for not doing that. It was, Reese reflected, the only thanks that had ever meant anything to him. He walked out to the evidence table before he left. The 2 halves of the federal authorization lay flat inside their clear sleeve, edges aligned, the tear running raggedly through the seal and through his own printed name. Mira Drayton had believed that tearing it would take something from him, that his authority lived in that rectangle of paper and could be destroyed by a woman with strong hands and an audience. But the authority had never been in the document, because the document was only a receipt. The authority was in years of standing in cold weather, looking at surfaces other people had signed for, and in the willingness to say no on a morning when saying yes would have been easier for everyone, including himself. Callum Hale caught him in the parking lot and apologized badly in fragments for closing the screen and for standing 4 feet away with his mouth shut while a woman tore up a federal document. Reese did not tell him it was all right because it had not been. He told him that the mark of a person is not that they never fold, but what they build afterward, so that the next time they are asked to fold, they have somewhere to stand. Out on the north side of the field, Soren Finch had already cut the bands off the first crate, and the federal restoration schedule ran for weeks. Every night of it logged, photographed, and verified by people who did not report to anyone whose name appeared on a plaque in the terminal lobby. Reese Calder drove out through Gate 4 in the same 9-year-old sedan with no escort, and nobody applauded, and the young officer at the booth raised a hand as the barrier came up. Behind him in the police division office, 2 maintenance workers were taking the nameplate off the lieutenant's door and the small brass letters spelling. Drayton went into a plastic bin along with a stapler and a framed photograph from a fundraising dinner. The clear evidence sleeve went into a case, the case went into a vehicle, and the vehicle turned onto the county road, with the fog burned entirely off the fields, and the morning, finally, ordinarily, bright. What Mira Drayton tore up was only a temporary piece of paper. The record of what she did will outlast every powerful name that was ever printed on that wall.